The Vampire King traced the shadow of fingerprints beneath her eyes in the empty diner at 2 a.m., but when she whispered the name of her attacker, every light in the district went dark. By dawn, the man who'd touched her was gone, and she realized protection from an ancient predator might cost more than bruises ever did. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Maya had been wiping down the same table for the third time when the bell above the diner door chimed at 2:13 in the morning, and she looked up to see him standing in the entrance with November cold rolling off his shoulders like smoke, the man who always ordered black coffee and left exact change, the one who hadn't been here in 3 months, though she'd caught herself watching the door more times than she wanted to admit. Constantine moved through the empty moonlight diner like he owned the fluorescent-lit space, his footsteps silent on the checkered linoleum, and Maya felt her pulse kick up for reasons that had nothing to do with the bruises hidden under her sleeves or the way her ribs still ached when she breathed too deep. He slid into the corner booth without a word, those pale eyes tracking her movements as she grabbed the coffee pot with hands that only shook a little, and when she approached his table, the smell of him hit her. Something cold and clean like winter air over stones that had never seen sunlight. "Black coffee," she said, not quite a question, and he nodded once, still watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, made her want to check her reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser to see what he was seeing. She poured carefully, hyper-aware of the way her uniform sleeve had ridden up slightly, the green fabric exposing just an inch of her left wrist, where Derek's fingers had dug in 2 nights ago when she'd asked him to leave. When she'd finally found the courage to say the words that had earned her a shove into the kitchen counter hard enough to crack something inside. When she set the cup down, Constantine's hand moved faster than she could track, his fingers circling her wrist with a gentleness that shocked her more than force would have, and he turned her arm slowly to expose the constellation of bruises blooming purple and yellow against her skin. "Who left these bruises on your eyes?" he asked, and his voice was like frost forming on glass, beautiful and dangerous and so cold it burned. Maya yanked her hand back, and the coffee sloshed in the cup, her face flooding with heat that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with being seen, truly seen, for the first time in months. "I'm clumsy," she started, the lie tasting like copper on her tongue. "I just tripped over some boxes at home and caught myself wrong." "Don't," Constantine said, and the single word carried such weight that Maya's breath caught in her chest. "I've seen every kind of wound in 800 years, and those are fingerprints, not accidents. So tell me who put their hands on you, or I will find out myself, and you won't like how I ask." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator cycled on with a mechanical whir, and Maya felt something crack open inside her chest, some dam she'd built to hold back the truth, the fear, the awful relief of someone finally noticing that she was breaking. "Derek Morrison," she whispered, the name barely audible over the ambient noise of the diner, and she couldn't look at Constantine when she said it, couldn't bear to see pity or disgust or worse, indifference. "He's my boyfriend," she added uselessly, as if that explained anything, as if it mattered. "It doesn't matter," she said, more to herself than to him, because what could this stranger do? What could anyone do, when Derek knew where she lived and worked, and had made it very clear what would happen if she told anyone, if she tried to leave? "It matters," Constantine said, and his voice dropped to something below human hearing, something that vibrated in Maya's bones and made the coffee cup rattle against its saucer. "It matters more than you know." Then every light in the diner died. Not flickered, not dimmed, but died completely, as if someone had cut the power at the source, and Maya gasped as darkness slammed down around them like a physical force. Her phone in her apron pocket went dark, the emergency exit signs winked out, even the streetlights visible through the windows vanished, and she heard the traffic signals outside click off in rapid succession. Darkness spreading outward in concentric circles that swallowed the entire district. In the absolute blackness, Maya couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. couldn't see anything except 2 points of gold light burning where Constantine sat, his eyes incandescent and inhuman and fixed on her with an attention that made her feel like the only person left in the world. She heard him stand, heard the whisper of expensive fabric as he moved, and then his voice came from right beside her ear, though she hadn't heard him approach. "Go home," he said, and something cold and smooth pressed into her palm, the texture of old paper and heavy stock. "Lock your door and don't open it for anyone but me. Do you understand?" "Yes," Maya breathed, and she felt rather than saw him leave, a displacement of air and then nothing. Just her standing alone in the dark diner with her heart hammering against her ribs and 3 crisp bills in her hand that she knew without counting were hundreds. The darkness held for another 2 hours and 34 minutes, long enough for Maya to close out her register by candlelight and walk home through streets gone medieval with the lack of electricity, past dark storefronts and apartments where people leaned out windows asking neighbors what happened. If this was an attack. If anyone knew when the power would return. Maya let herself into her studio apartment and locked the door and the deadbolt and the chain, then stood with her back pressed against the wood, trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to rationalize how a man's question had killed the lights in 6 city blocks. She checked her phone obsessively, even though it was dead, plugged it into a portable charger, and watched the screen illuminate to show 63 missed calls from Derek, 27 texts that progressed from angry to panicked to something that looked like fear. "Where are you?" the last one read, sent at 3:42. "I'm sorry, baby. I didn't mean it. Please call me." Maya deleted them all and felt nothing, just a strange hollow space where her fear used to live. The power came back at 4:47 in the morning, lights blazing to life all at once across the district, and Maya's phone immediately started buzzing with news alerts about the mysterious blackout, infrastructure failure, officials investigating. She ignored them and checked Derek's social media instead, found his last post was from 6 hours ago, a blurry selfie at his apartment, with the caption "Home for the night." But when she clicked through to the local police scanner feeds, she saw a report of an abandoned vehicle at the state line. Derek's beat-up Honda with the driver's side door hanging open and no sign of the owner, and she felt something twist in her stomach that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite relief. She must have fallen asleep on the couch still wearing her uniform because she woke to weak November sunlight filtering through her curtains and her entire body aching like she'd run a marathon. When she finally dragged herself to the door to check if her morning newspaper had been delivered, she found something else on the doormat instead. A small crystal vial, no bigger than her thumb, filled with clear liquid that caught the light like a prism, and tucked underneath it a note written in black ink on heavy cardstock. For the bruises, it read in handwriting that looked like it had been formed with a fountain pen, each letter perfectly precise. "They'll fade by morning." The signature was just a single letter, K, and Maya picked up the vial with trembling fingers and pulled the stopper, breathed in a scent like winter and metal and something older than names. She dabbed a drop on the worst bruise on her wrist and watched in real time as the purple faded to yellow to green to nothing, the skin smoothing out as if Derek's fingers had never marked her, as if she'd never been touched at all. Maya sat on her doorstep in the cold morning air and used the entire vial, erasing every bruise and scratch and tender spot until her body was her own again, and she thought about a man with gold eyes who had killed the lights in half the city when she whispered a name, who had promised protection in a voice that sounded like he'd ended empires for less. She thought about Derek's empty apartment and abandoned car and the way he'd simply vanished like he'd never existed, and she wondered what kind of man could make another man disappear, what kind of power operated outside human law and human consequence. The note was still clutched in her hand, and Maya read it again, those 6 words and a single initial, and she felt terror and confusion, and beneath it all, a tiny, fragile seed of something that might have been hope, the first hope she'd felt in months. That maybe she didn't have to live like this, didn't have to accept bruises as the price of not being alone. She looked down at her unmarked skin and thought about the cost of protection from a man who wasn't a man at all, who moved through darkness like he owned it, whose eyes burned gold in absolute blackness. And she knew with bone-deep certainty that Constantine would come back, that this wasn't over, that whatever had started in the diner at 2 in the morning was just beginning. Maya's shift at the diner that evening felt surreal because her skin was perfect, unmarked, every bruise erased like they'd never existed, and she kept catching herself touching her wrist where Derek's fingers had left their signature, finding only smooth skin that didn't ache when she pressed down. She worked the counter with a strange lightness in her chest, pouring coffee and sliding plates of pie across the formica, while her mind circled back to gold eyes in the darkness, and a man who'd made the world go black with just her whispered confession. When she finally clocked out at 10:30 and opened her locker to grab her jacket, she found the envelope waiting on top of her folded street clothes, cream cardstock so thick it felt like fabric, sealed with actual red wax that bore an impression she couldn't quite make out in the flickering locker room light. Her name was written across the front in calligraphy that looked like it belonged in a museum, each letter formed with such precision that Maya knew whoever had written it had been doing so for far longer than she'd been alive. She broke the seal carefully and pulled out a single card that read, "The Tower. Midnight. Come alone. You're safe," followed by an address in the financial district that everyone in the city knew belonged to the Glass and Steel headquarters, where foreign investors supposedly managed international holdings. Maya should have thrown it away, should have recognized the command for what it was. But her fingers were already tucking the card into her pocket as she shrugged on her jacket and told herself she was just curious, that she could always turn around, that going to meet a man who'd made another man disappear was probably the worst decision she'd ever made, but somehow felt like the only decision available. The November night was cold enough to sting her lungs as she walked the 12 blocks to the financial district, past closed storefronts and the few bars still serving late-night crowds. And with each step, she felt the pull stronger, that same magnetic draw she'd felt in the diner when Constantine had looked at her like she mattered. The tower rose 43 stories above the surrounding buildings, all glass and chrome and sharp angles that caught the city lights and threw them back like a challenge. And Maya stood on the sidewalk staring up at it until her neck ached, trying to find the courage to cross the threshold. The doorman was expecting her, a man in an expensive suit who nodded once and held open the heavy glass door without asking her name, and Maya found herself in a lobby of white marble and recessed lighting that was more art installation than functional space. The elevator doors opened at her approach like they'd been waiting, and when she stepped inside, she saw there were no buttons, no floor indicators, just mirrors on 3 sides and a ceiling of hammered copper that reflected her pale face back at her in fractured pieces. The doors closed and the elevator rose so smoothly, she barely felt the movement, just a slight pressure in her ears as the floors ticked by in silence, and Maya watched the city fall away beneath her through the glass back wall until the lights looked like stars that had fallen and forgotten how to rise. When the doors opened again, she stepped into a space that stole her breath, a penthouse that was more window than wall, floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides that made her feel suspended in the sky itself, with the city spread below like an offering. The floor was white marble veined with gold, the furniture minimal and modern, just one black leather chair positioned near the windows, and a low table of dark wood that looked hand-carved from a single massive tree. There were books on shelves built into the one solid wall, leather-bound volumes that looked ancient, their spines marked with symbols Maya didn't recognize. And the whole space felt cold and beautiful and profoundly lonely in a way that made her chest ache. Constantine stood by the far window with his back to her, his silhouette sharp against the city lights, and he didn't turn when she entered, though she knew he'd heard the elevator, knew he was aware of every breath she took. "What happened to Derek?" Maya asked, because she needed to know, needed to hear him say it out loud, even if the answer terrified her. "He's been relocated to places where your name will never reach him," Constantine said, still not turning, his voice carrying easily across the empty space. "And his hands will never reach anyone." "That's not an answer," Maya said, taking 3 steps into the room and stopping because something about the space demanded stillness, demanded respect. Constantine turned then, and the city lights behind him made his pale hair look silver, his eyes catching the glow and throwing it back like a cat's. "It's the only answer you need," he said, and there was something final in his tone that told Maya this topic was closed, that whatever had been done to Derek Morrison existed in a space outside human law and human consequence. He moved toward her with that same impossible grace she'd noticed in the diner, crossing the distance between them in strides that seemed too smooth to be entirely human, and Maya forced herself to stand still, even though every instinct screamed at her to back away from a predator. "Who else knows he hurt you?" Constantine asked, and the question landed like a blow because it was the one Maya had been avoiding asking herself for months. "No one," she whispered. And the word echoed in the vast space, came back to her sounding even more pathetic than it had leaving her mouth. "I don't have family," she continued, the explanation spilling out before she could stop it. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 19, and I was an only child, and Derek, he made sure I didn't keep friends, made sure I understood that spending time with other people was a kind of betrayal. I thought," she stopped, swallowed hard against the tightness in her throat. "I thought maybe I deserved it, that if I was better or quieter or more careful, then he wouldn't get angry, and by the time I realized that was insane, I was so deep in it I couldn't see a way out." Constantine's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, some flash of emotion that looked almost like pain, like he was remembering something he'd buried centuries ago. He turned away from her and walked to the windows, pressed one pale hand against the glass like he was testing its solidity. "I can make sure no one hurts you again," he said quietly, and Maya heard layers in his voice she couldn't quite parse, grief and anger and something that might have been longing. "But protection of this depth creates obligations, bonds that tie you to me in ways that human relationships don't encompass." "What kind of bonds?" Maya asked, because she needed to understand the cost, needed to know what she was trading her fear for. Constantine began to circle her slowly, keeping several feet of distance, but moving with the focused attention of something deciding whether its prey was worth the chase. "The kind where your safety becomes woven into my reputation," he said, each word measured and precise. "Where anyone who harms you answers to me personally. Where hurting you becomes an act of war against everything I've built in this city. Where you, in turn, become visible as mine." Maya's pulse kicked up at that last word, at the possessive weight of it, and she turned to keep him in her line of sight as he circled. "What does yours mean?" she asked, and Constantine stopped moving, stood perfectly still in a way that made him look like a statue carved from ice. "It means I stop pretending I haven't been watching you for 6 months," he said, and there was something raw in his admission that made Maya's breath catch. "It means when you walk into a room, everyone who matters knows that harming you is the last thing they'll ever do. It means," he paused. And for the first time since she'd met him, he seemed to be choosing his words carefully, searching for the right way to explain something that had no human equivalent. "It means you'll never be invisible again." The words hit Maya like a physical force because she'd spent 2 years making herself small, making herself forgettable, learning to take up as little space as possible in the hope that if she was quiet enough, Derek wouldn't notice her, wouldn't have a reason to be angry. The idea of being seen, truly seen and claimed and made visible, was more terrifying than any threat of violence, because violence she understood. But this was something else entirely. "You're offering me protection," Maya said slowly, working through the implications. "But the cost is becoming publicly yours, becoming a target for anyone who wants to get to you." Constantine smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression, just a baring of teeth that reminded Maya he wasn't human no matter how beautiful his face. "Anyone who tries to use you against me will discover very quickly why that's a fatal mistake," he said. "I'm offering you sanctuary, but sanctuary in my world has formalities, has rules and expectations that you need to understand before you accept. If you say yes, you won't just be safe, you'll be seen as mine, as my He hesitated over the word. My consort, my protected, mine in every way that matters to the people who would otherwise see you as prey. Maya wanted to ask what people, wanted to demand explanations about what he was and what his world consisted of, and how any of this was possible, but the questions died in her throat, because on some fundamental level, she already knew the answers, had known since she watched his eyes burn gold in absolute darkness. She thought about going back to her apartment alone, thought about jumping at every sound and wondering if Derek would come back, if the next man would be worse, if she'd spend the rest of her life small and scared and invisible. She thought about the way Constantine had looked at her in the diner, like her pain was unacceptable, like her bruises were a personal offense he intended to rectify, and she realized that for the first time in years, someone was offering her a choice that didn't involve choosing between bad and worse. What do you get out of this? Maya asked, because nothing was free, and men like Constantine didn't offer protection without expecting something in return. He was silent for a long moment, standing backlit by the city with his face in shadow. And when he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard it. I get to keep something fragile and mortal and impossibly brave safe from a world that would break you without thinking twice, he said. I get to remember what it feels like to care about something that will end. I get, and here his voice dropped to almost a whisper, I get to not be alone. The honesty of it stole Maya's breath, and she saw in that moment how profoundly lonely this beautiful cold space was. How Constantine had surrounded himself with glass and empty rooms and books older than countries, had built a fortress that kept everything out, including connection, including warmth. She opened her mouth to respond, but the elevator dinged behind her and the door slid open to reveal a woman who moved like liquid violence. All sharp angles and cold beauty in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Maya made in 6 months. My lord, the woman said, and her voice could have frozen oceans, her ice-blue eyes taking in Maya with a single dismissive glance. The council will have questions about your activities tonight. Constantine's expression shuddered completely, and he became something carved from marble, ancient and remote and utterly inhuman. Then they can ask them, Irina, he said. This is Maya, and she's under my protection as of this moment. Irina's gaze sharpened on Maya like a blade finding a target, and Maya forced herself to meet those cold eyes, forced herself not to flinch or look away, even though every survival instinct was screaming. She's mortal, Irina said flatly, as if that explained everything. As if Maya's humanity was a flaw that negated any other consideration. Yes, Constantine said, and there was steel in his voice, a command that made even Irina's spine straighten slightly. And she's mine, which means she's yours to protect as well, do you understand? Irina's jaw tightened, but she inclined her head fractionally in what might have been acknowledgement or might have been barely contained fury. The council will still have questions, she repeated, and then she was gone. The elevator doors closing on her disapproving stare. Maya realized she was shaking and couldn't make herself stop, adrenaline flooding her system now that the immediate threat had passed. That's what I mean by visible, Constantine said quietly, and when Maya looked at him, his expression had softened slightly, some of the marble mask cracking to reveal concern beneath. Everyone in my world will know you're mine now, will know that touching you means answering to me, and some of them will test that protection just to see if I mean it. The cost isn't just being seen, it's being a target, and I need you to understand that before you say yes. Maya thought about the crystal vial in her unmarked skin, thought about Derek's abandoned car and the way the city had gone dark at her whispered confession, thought about standing in this cold, beautiful space with a man who'd just admitted he was lonely and watching her and willing to make her visible when all she'd wanted for 2 years was to disappear. What if I say no? She asked. Then you walk away, Constantine said simply. And I'll still make sure Derek never comes near you again, still make sure you're safe in the ways I can manage without a formal bond. But you'll be alone, and I'll go back to pretending I don't watch for you every time I pass the diner, and we'll both be exactly as lonely as we were yesterday." Maya looked out at the city spread below them like a sea of light and made her decision. Constantine watched Maya's face as she processed what he was offering and saw the exact moment she made her decision, saw her spine straighten and her chin lift in that defiant way he was already beginning to recognize as uniquely hers. And when she said yes with a voice that barely shook, he felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in 3 centuries. Something almost like fear mixed with triumph, mixed with the terrible certainty that he'd just changed the trajectory of his immortal life for a mortal woman who would be dust before he blinked. He pulled out his phone and sent the summons before he could second-guess himself, a single coded message that would drag 7 ancient vampires from whatever they were doing at 2 in the morning and force them into emergency council session. And within minutes the penthouse began to fill with light as the holograms materialized one by one, his fellow rulers appearing as sculptures made of colored radiance that cast rainbow shadows across the white marble floor. Constantine had known most of them for half a millennium or more, had fought beside some and against others, had built this fragile peace between vampire clans through centuries of negotiation and calculated violence, and he knew that what he was about to announce would fracture that peace in ways he couldn't fully predict. He stood with Maya beside him, felt her fear like static electricity in the air between them, and addressed the council with the formal cadence he used only for official proclamations. "I invoke Custodio Mortalis," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 800 years of authority. "I claim formal protection over this mortal under the ancient law, witnessed and binding." The council chamber erupted in a chaos of light and sound as all 7 vampires tried to speak at once, their holographic forms flickering with agitation, and Constantine let them rage for 30 seconds before he lifted one hand for silence. The eldest vampire there, a woman named Octavia, who'd walked the earth since Rome was young, materialized more solidly than the others, her form sharp enough to cast real shadows. "For a waitress," she said, and her Latin accent made the word sound like an insult, "you would invoke a law unused for 2 centuries for a human nobody." Maya flinched beside him, and Constantine felt rage spike hot in his chest, felt his control slip just enough that the lights in the penthouse flickered. "She's not nobody," he said quietly, and the quiet was more dangerous than shouting. "She's mine, which makes her somebody to every creature in this city who values their continued existence." A younger council member, Victor, who'd only been vampire for 200 years and still remembered what it was like to be mortal, leaned forward in his holographic chair. "You risk exposing us all," he said, and there was genuine concern in his voice rather than contempt. "Humans are protected en masse through our treaties, through the systems we've built to keep them safe from rogues and zealots. Protecting one individually, claiming one publicly, it draws attention we've spent centuries avoiding." Constantine had expected this argument and had his response ready. "I invoke my right as king," he said, letting the title carry its full weight. "If I claim her publicly and she accepts the bond, the pact is law regardless of council approval. But I'm offering you the courtesy of witness, of making this official, rather than simply taking what's mine." He felt Maya's sharp intake of breath at the possessive language and filed away her reaction for later examination. The council members exchanged glances that traveled faster than light between their holographic forms, and Constantine knew they were communicating through the private channels their ancient bond allowed, arguing without words about how to handle a king who was technically within his rights, but politically insane. Finally, Octavia spoke again, her form sharpening until she looked almost solid enough to touch. "The Custodio Mortalis requires blood exchange witnessed and bound," she said, and her smile was all teeth. "If she breaks the pact by betraying our secrets to humans, she dies. If you break it by failing to protect her, you lose your throne. Are you truly willing to stake 8 centuries of power on keeping one fragile mortal alive?" "Yes," Constantine said without hesitation, and he felt Maya turn to stare at him, but kept his eyes on the council. "The ritual," he continued, invoking the formal language that turned this from debate into law. I claim it. Octavia's smile widened, and Constantine realized she was assuming Maya would refuse once she understood the terms, was counting on human self-preservation to end this before it began. Very well, she said. Let Irina prepare the chamber. Constantine turned to where his second stood in the shadows and nodded once, saw her jaw tighten with disapproval before she moved to obey. Irina had been with him for 400 years, had followed him through wars and political upheavals and the slow transformation from warlord to king, and he knew she thought this was the worst decision he'd ever made. She returned minutes later carrying a silver bowl so old it predated Christianity, a ceremonial blade with a handle of carved bone, and a single white candle that she placed on the low table with movements that spoke of ritual performed 1,000 times. The council holograms arranged themselves in a circle around the space, their combined light turning the penthouse into something that belonged in a cathedral. And Maya stood very still in the center of it all, looking small and human and impossibly brave. Constantine moved to stand beside her and explained in a low voice that only she could hear exactly what the ritual would require. "You'll cut your palm with this blade," he said, showing her the wickedly sharp edge. "Speak the words I teach you. Let 3 drops of blood fall into the wine I've already mixed with mine. Then drink. The bond will mark you with a shimmer in your eyes that humans won't see, but vampires will recognize instantly as my protection. You'll feel what I feel when you're in danger, anger or fear, or the need to reach you. And I'll feel when you bleed, when you're hurt, when your heart races with terror. It's intimate in ways that have nothing to do with physical touch." He watched her process this, saw her fear war with determination, and then she asked the question that changed everything. "If I do this," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "can I still say no to you, to anything you ask?" Constantine went very still because he hadn't expected her to negotiate, hadn't expected a mortal terrified and alone to claim agency in a room full of predators who could kill her with a thought. He looked at her fully for the first time since the council had assembled, really looked at her, this small, fierce woman who'd survived 2 years of abuse and was now demanding terms from a vampire king. "Yes," he said, and his voice came out softer than he'd intended. "This makes you mine to protect, not mine to command. If you want to leave tomorrow, you leave. I'll still be bound to keep you safe, still be obligated to answer any threat against you, but you owe me nothing except silence about what you learn. The bond goes one direction, Maya. It protects you and binds me." The council stirred at this admission, and Constantine heard Octavia's sharp intake of breath, heard Victor mutter something in Russian that might have been a prayer or a curse. Maya picked up the ceremonial blade, and Constantine saw her hand shake only slightly as she positioned it against her palm. He spoke the words of the ritual in the old language, the one that predated Latin and Greek and had no name because the people who'd spoken it were dust 10,000 years ago, and he taught her the sounds phonetically, made her repeat them until her pronunciation was close enough that the magic would recognize the intent. When she was ready, she pressed the blade down and Constantine felt the cut like it was his own flesh parting, felt her pain spike bright and hot through the bond that was already forming between them even before the ritual was complete. 3 drops of blood fell into the silver bowl, where his own blood mixed with wine the color of garnets, and Maya lifted the bowl with both hands and drank without hesitation, her throat working as she swallowed. The temperature in the penthouse dropped 20 degrees in an instant, windows frosting over with patterns that looked like fractals, like the mathematical expression of cold itself, and the candle flame burned white-blue instead of orange. Maya gasped and stumbled, and Constantine caught her before she could fall, felt her skin ice-cold against his own perpetual chill, felt something slam into place in his chest like a door locking that would never open again. When the light faded and the temperature slowly began to climb back toward normal, Maya's eyes had changed. The brown irises now shot through with silver starbursts that caught the light and threw it back like captured stars. and Constantine knew every vampire who saw her would recognize her instantly as his, as protected, as untouchable. "I can feel you," Maya whispered, her hand pressed against her chest like she was trying to contain something too big for her body. Cold and old and sad, so sad it hurts. Constantine swallowed against unexpected emotion and nodded. "I can feel you," he said quietly, aware that the council was watching and hearing every word. "Warm and young and terrified, but holding your ground anyway. The bond will fade slightly over time, become background noise unless one of us is in danger. But it's permanent, Maya, you understand that." She nodded, and Constantine helped her stand on her own, watched her find her balance, and when she looked up at him with those silver-starred eyes, he felt the bond hum between them like a plucked string. Octavia materialized more solidly than before, her holographic form sharp enough that Constantine could see the ancient disapproval in her expression. "You've bound yourself to something that will die in a breath," she said, and her voice carried centuries of watching mortals age and crumble while vampires remained unchanged. "She'll age, wither, die, and you'll still be bound to protect a corpse, still be obligated to a memory. The throne you risk for this will long outlast her heartbeat." Constantine looked at Maya and saw his own mortality reflected in her eyes, saw the brief bright spark of a human life against the endless dark of his own existence, and made his choice the way he'd been making it since the moment she'd whispered Derek Morrison's name in a diner at 2 in the morning. "Then I'll make that breath count," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a vow that would outlast empires. "Every moment she lives will matter more than centuries I've wasted, and when she's gone, I'll carry the memory of having cared about something that could end, something precious because it was temporary. Isn't that what we've all forgotten? That meaning requires mortality? That we've lived so long we've forgotten what it is to value time?" The council was silent, and Constantine saw surprise flicker across several holographic faces, saw Victor nod slowly like he was remembering something he'd buried. Octavia held his gaze for a long moment and then inclined her head fractionally. "The bond is witnessed and accepted," she said formally. "Let it be known that Maya," she paused, waiting. "Chen?" Maya supplied quietly. "Let it be known that Maya Chen is under the protection of Constantine, king of the Northern Territories, bound by Custodio Mortalis until death claims one or both." The council holograms began to fade one by one, light sculptures dissolving back into data streams and distant bodies, until only Victor remained for a moment longer. "She asked if she could say no to you," he said, and there was something like approval in his voice. "That's more negotiation than most vampires manage with you, Constantine. Perhaps she's stronger than we think." Then he was gone, and Constantine was alone with Maya and Irina, the penthouse suddenly feeling vast and empty now that the ritual light had faded. Maya swayed slightly, and Constantine steadied her, felt through the bond that she was exhausted and overwhelmed and running on pure adrenaline. Irina approached with her usual predatory grace and studied Maya with cold assessment. "My lord," she said, and her tone was carefully neutral. "The council will be watching for any sign of weakness, any indication that your judgment has been compromised by this bond. There are factions who already question your commitment to vampire supremacy, who see protection of individual humans as the first step toward," she paused, "toward caring about them as more than food sources." Constantine met Irina's ice-blue eyes and saw the genuine concern there beneath the disapproval. "Let them watch," he said, "and let them understand that anyone who tests this protection will discover exactly how committed I am." Irina nodded once and turned to leave but paused at the elevator. She didn't beg during the ritual, Irina said without turning around. "Didn't cry or break, I'll give her that much." Then the elevator doors closed, and Constantine was alone with Maya, feeling her heartbeat through the bond like it was his own, feeling her terror and exhaustion, and beneath it all, a core of steel that had survived 2 years of abuse and was now bound to him forever. He looked down at her silver-starred eyes and wondered if binding her to him was protection or the most selfish thing he'd done in 8 centuries. Wondered if he'd saved her or just made her a target in a war she didn't understand. And then Maya spoke, and her words cut through his spiraling thoughts. "I can feel you doubting," she said softly, one hand still pressed over her heart. "Stop it. I chose this. I negotiated the terms, and I'll deal with whatever comes." Constantine felt something in his chest crack open at her fierce certainty and realized that the bond went deeper than blood or magic, that somewhere between the diner and this moment, he'd started to care about this mortal woman in ways that had nothing to do with protection and everything to do with the terrifying possibility that after 800 years of existing, he might finally have found a reason to actually live. Maya had insisted on working her evening shift at the diner, despite Constantine's carefully worded suggestion that he could provide for her needs, that she didn't have to serve coffee and clear tables when she was bound to a vampire king who owned half the financial district, and the look she'd given him had been sharp enough to cut. "I'm not a pet you keep," she'd said, standing in his penthouse at 8 in the morning after sleeping 3 hours on his obscenely comfortable couch because going back to her apartment alone had felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. "I work, I pay my rent, I take care of myself, and if being bound to you means giving that up, then maybe we need to renegotiate the terms." He'd studied her for a long moment with those pale eyes that saw too much, and then he'd nodded once and said he'd assign Irina to shadow her, to stay close enough to intervene, but far enough to let Maya maintain the illusion of independence. Maya had hated the compromise, but accepted it because she wasn't stupid enough to think that the silver shimmer in her eyes wouldn't make her a target, wasn't naive enough to believe that the ritual last night had made her safe rather than visible. So she'd worked her shift with Irina somewhere in the background, a cold presence Maya could feel even when she couldn't see her, and she'd poured coffee and taken orders and pretended that everything was normal even though she could feel Constantine at the edge of her awareness, like a winter wind that never quite touched her skin. The text had come through at 9:45, an unknown number that made Maya's stomach clench even before she read the message. "Derek wants to apologize," it said, just those 4 words followed by an address in the warehouse district. "Come alone, or he runs." Maya had stared at the screen and known with absolute certainty that it was a trap, that Derek was gone in ways that meant he'd never send a text again. But she'd also known that she was going anyway because 2 years of abuse had trained her to respond when he called, had carved pathways in her brain that reason couldn't override. She'd told her manager she was taking her break and walked out into the November rain without her jacket, without telling Irina where she was going, moving on autopilot toward the address like a moth toward flame. The warehouse district was a skeleton of the city's industrial past, all rusted metal and broken windows, and streets that flooded when it rained because the storm drains had been clogged for a decade. And Maya's shoes were soaked through by the time she reached the address, her hair plastered to her skull and rain running down her neck in cold rivulets. She felt Irina following at a distance, and took some small comfort in that presence, even as she pushed open the warehouse door and stepped into darkness that smelled like motor oil and rust, and something older that might have been blood. The first vampire materialized from the shadows so fast Maya didn't have time to scream, just a blur of movement, and then a figure standing between her and the door, tall and angular with eyes that reflected the distant streetlights like a cat's. 2 more stepped out from behind stacked pallets, and Maya's heart kicked into overdrive, the bond with Constantine flaring hot in her chest as her fear spiked. "You're not Derek," Maya said stupidly, backing up until her shoulders hit a concrete pillar and the lead vampire smiled with too many teeth. "No," he said, and his voice had an accent Maya couldn't place. "Something European and old. Derek Morrison is being educated about the consequences of touching what belongs to our king, but you're here because Constantine broke a century of silence for a mortal, made himself vulnerable for a heartbeat, and we're going to prove that his judgment is compromised." Maya felt the bond pulse in her chest and knew Constantine could feel her fear, knew he was probably already moving. But the vampires were fast, and she was just human, and they closed the distance before she could run. "He's not brought low," Maya said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, some core of defiance rising up through her terror. You are. Coming after me instead of facing him directly, hiding in warehouses and sending fake texts like cowards. The leader backhanded her casually, and Maya's head snapped to the side, pain exploding across her cheekbone sharp enough to make her vision blur. Across the city, she felt Constantine's rage detonate through the bond like a nuclear blast, felt his absolute focus lock onto her location with the precision of a guided missile. The vampires attacked and Maya ran, her shoes skidding on wet concrete as she dodged between pallets and machinery, but they were so much faster than her, moving with inhuman speed that made her attempts at escape look pathetic. One of them caught her by the arm and swung her into a concrete support column hard enough that she felt something crack, her skull connecting with stone and the world fragmenting into stars and darkness, and the copper taste of blood in her mouth. She felt Constantine screaming through the bond, felt his terror and fury as he experienced her pain secondhand. And then she was on the ground looking up at the lead vampire who held her by the throat and lifted her off her feet like she weighed nothing. If she's his weakness, the vampire said, addressing his companions while Maya clawed uselessly at the hand crushing her windpipe, then she's our weapon. Proof that caring about mortals makes him unfit to rule. The mighty Constantine brought low by a mortal's heartbeat. Isn't that poetic? Maya couldn't breathe. Couldn't think past the pressure on her throat and the bond screaming in her chest, and then Irina materialized from the shadows like death itself, moving faster than Maya's eyes could track. She killed the first rogue vampire in a single motion, something that involved a blade and a spray of ash that used to be a body, and then she was fighting the other two with a grace that looked like dancing, except every movement ended in violence. But the leader still had Maya by the throat, and he squeezed harder, lifting her higher, and Maya felt her vision going dark at the edges, felt her lungs burning for air they couldn't find. Then the warehouse doors exploded inward with a sound like the end of the world, metal shrieking and concrete cracking, and Constantine stood in the rain-soaked opening with his eyes burning gold, and his face transformed into something that had never been human. He moved faster than sight, crossed the warehouse in a blur that Maya's oxygen-starved brain couldn't process, and then the hand around her throat was gone and she was falling. She hit the ground hard and gasped air back into her lungs, coughing and retching. And when she looked up through streaming eyes, she saw Constantine standing over her, holding the leader's head in one hand and the body crumbling to ash in the other. The silence was absolute except for the rain drumming on the roof and Maya's ragged breathing, and then Constantine dropped the head and it disintegrated before it hit the ground. He knelt beside her in a pool of rainwater that had leaked through the roof, his expensive suit soaked and ruined, and when he touched her face, his hands were shaking. "I felt you break," he whispered, and his voice was raw in a way Maya had never heard, stripped of all the controlled authority he wore like armor. "I felt you scream. I felt your skull crack against concrete and your throat being crushed, and I felt you starting to die. Don't do that again." Maya tried to speak, but her throat was too damaged, could only manage a whisper that came out like gravel. "I thought I could handle it." Constantine's laugh was bitter, and he gathered her up like she weighed nothing, cradled her against his chest, while Irina finished executing the last rogue vampire with efficient brutality. "You were handling it," he said, standing with her in his arms and moving toward the shattered doorway. "And then I felt your skull crack, and He stopped, couldn't finish the sentence, and Maya felt through the bond exactly what he'd experienced. The echo of her pain magnified by 800 years of never feeling anything that strongly, the terror of losing something he'd just claimed. She rested her head against his shoulder and let him carry her out into the rain, let the cold water wash the blood from her face, and she watched over his shoulder as Irina emerged from the warehouse looking pristine, despite having just killed 2 vampires. "You didn't beg," Irina said, falling into step beside Constantine, as he carried Maya toward a black car that had appeared at the curb driven by someone Maya didn't recognize. "I'll give you that much. You didn't cry or plead or try to bargain with them." Maya wanted to say that begging had never worked with Derek, so why would it work with vampires? Wanted to explain that 2 years of abuse had taught her that dignity was the only thing she could control, but her throat hurt too much to speak. Constantine settled her into the back seat and slid in beside her, keeping her pulled against him like he couldn't bear to let go. And Maya felt the bond humming between them like a live wire, felt his fear gradually transforming into something darker and more possessive. She'd gone to the warehouse to prove she wasn't helpless, to demonstrate that being bound to him didn't make her a prisoner or a pet, and instead she'd proven exactly what the rogues had intended, that she was his weakness, that caring about her made him vulnerable in ways 8 centuries of power couldn't protect against. But she'd also seen what happened to people who tried to use that weakness against him, had watched him rip a vampire's head off with his bare hands, and felt through the bond, the feral protectiveness that drove him, the absolute certainty that anything threatening her would be destroyed, regardless of cost or consequence. The car moved through rain-slicked streets and Maya's vision kept blurring, her head throbbing where it had cracked against concrete, and she felt Constantine's fear spike every time her eyes closed. "Stay awake," he said quietly, his hand gentle against her cheek despite the violence she'd just watched those hands commit. "You might have a concussion. You need to stay conscious until I can get you somewhere safe." Maya forced her eyes open and looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time since he'd exploded through the warehouse doors, and she saw that his face was spattered with blood and ash, his pale hair darkened with rain, his eyes still burning with that inhuman gold light. "You felt it," she whispered, her damaged throat making the words painful. "When I got hurt, you felt all of it." Constantine's jaw tightened, and he nodded. "Every second," he said. "From the moment the first vampire touched you, I felt your fear. And when your head hit concrete, I felt my own skull crack in sympathy. And when he started choking you, I felt like I was suffocating. The bond works both ways, Maya, which means your pain is my pain, and I will burn this entire city down before I let you feel that again." The possessiveness in his voice should have terrified her, should have reminded her too much of Derek's controlling jealousy, but it didn't, because Derek's control had been about owning her, and Constantine's was about keeping her breathing. She'd seen the difference in his shaking hands, and heard it in his raw voice, and felt it through the bond that connected them, the way his fear for her was greater than his rage at being challenged. The car pulled up to the glass tower, and Constantine carried her inside, past the doorman who didn't even blink at the blood, into the private elevator that rose smoothly toward the penthouse. Maya's head was spinning, and her throat felt like she'd swallowed broken glass, but through it all, she was acutely aware of Constantine's arms around her, the way he held her, like she was precious and breakable, the way his thumb traced gentle circles on her shoulder, like he needed the reassurance that she was still alive. When the elevator opened, Irina was already there somehow, moving ahead to prepare something Maya couldn't see, and Constantine carried her to the black leather chair by the windows and settled her into it carefully. He knelt in front of her and examined the damage with clinical precision, his fingers ghosting over the bruises forming on her throat, the cut on her scalp where her head had hit concrete. And Maya saw his face transform with each new injury he catalogued, saw the controlled mask slip further away. "I'm going to give you my blood," he said quietly, and it wasn't a question, but she appreciated that he explained it anyway. "It will heal the concussion and the bruising, make sure there's no permanent damage." Maya nodded because speaking hurt too much, and watched as he bit his own wrist with casual violence, watched his blood well up dark and strange, and when he pressed it to her mouth, she drank without hesitation. It tasted like metal and cold and something ancient that had no name, and she felt the pain in her head begin to recede almost immediately, felt her throat opening up and the pressure behind her eyes easing. When she'd had enough, he pulled away and licked his own wrist to seal the wound. And Maya watched the skin knit back together in seconds. "The warehouse was a trap," she said, her voice still rough but functional. "They wanted to prove you were weak for protecting me, wanted to use me as leverage." Constantine's expression went absolutely cold, and Maya felt his rage through the bond, banked but not extinguished. "They proved only that attacking you is suicide," he said. "Word will spread about what happened tonight. about how fast I moved and how brutally I ended them. The rogues wanted to demonstrate weakness, and instead they demonstrated exactly why challenging me is fatal. Maya thought about the leader's head crumbling to ash in Constantine's hand, thought about the casual violence and the absolute certainty of his movements, and she realized that being his meant being the thing he would destroy worlds to protect. I made you vulnerable, she said quietly. That's what the bond does. It gives your enemies a target. Constantine cupped her face in both hands and met her eyes, his pale gaze intense enough to steal her breath. You made me something other than a ghost walking through centuries, he said. Yes, you're a vulnerability, but you're also the first thing I've cared about in 300 years. The first person who makes me feel like existing matters. I'll take the vulnerability if it means I get to keep you. Maya felt tears prick her eyes and blamed them on the head injury, blamed them on shock and adrenaline and not on the way his words cracked something open in her chest. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his, felt the cold of him against her skin, felt the bond settle into something steady and sure between them. I won't be stupid again, she whispered. Won't go running into traps to prove I'm independent. Constantine's hands tightened fractionally on her face. You weren't stupid, he said. You were brave, and that scared me more than anything else tonight. The realization that you'll always choose courage over safety. Maya pulled back enough to meet his eyes and saw in them the reflection of her own silver-starred gaze, saw two people bound together by blood and magic, and something deeper that neither of them had named yet. Through the windows behind him, the city spread out like a promise and a threat. And Maya understood for the first time that being visible meant being a target, but it also meant mattering, meant being worth the rage and the fear, and the absolute certainty that someone would move heaven and earth to keep her breathing. Constantine felt the council's arrival like a cold front moving through the penthouse, 6 immortals manifesting from shadow and night to stand in his living room, with expressions carved from centuries of disapproval. And he left Maya in the bedroom where she was healing from the warehouse attack, where 15 minutes ago he had offered her his wrist and watched her drink his blood for the first time. An intimacy that had nothing to do with the ritual and everything to do with the way her eyes had met his while his blood slid down her throat, the way she had held his arm gently, even though he could feel her hunger through the bond, the strange, tender violence of feeding someone who mattered. The council had convened an emergency session, and this time they were physically present rather than projecting through mirrors, which meant the situation was critical enough to warrant the risk of gathering in one location 6 of the oldest vampires in North America, standing in a semicircle around his living room like judges at a trial. Elara was there with her ice-blonde hair and eyes like frozen lakes, and Marcus, who had been old when Rome fell, and 4 others whose names carried weight enough to topple kingdoms. And they looked at Constantine with the particular coldness reserved for kings who had disappointed their makers. She is a liability, Elara said without preamble, her voice carrying the accent of a language that no longer existed. The rogues are organizing. 3 more cells have declared against your rule in the last hour, and they are using the mortal as proof that you have lost perspective, that you value one heartbeat over the stability we have maintained for centuries. Constantine stood by the windows with his hands in his pockets, outwardly calm, even though he could feel Maya listening from the bedroom, could sense her presence through the bond like a candle flame he was acutely aware of in the darkness. I value what I choose to value, he said quietly. The rogues were always going to find an excuse for rebellion. If not Maya, then something else. Some other perceived weakness they could exploit in their pathetic bid for power. Marcus stepped forward, and his ancient eyes held something that might have been sympathy if vampires were capable of such mortal emotions. The humans are noticing disappearances, he said. Derek Morrison's body was found in the river this morning, drained and marked with signs of vampire feeding. And the police are investigating, asking questions we would prefer remain unasked. Your mortal has destabilized our carefully maintained invisibility, has made us visible in ways that invite exactly the kind of attention we have spent centuries avoiding. Constantine felt his jaw tighten because he knew they were right, even as he refused to accept their conclusion. Knew that protecting Maya had consequences that rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. She did not ask to be marked, he said. She did not ask for Derek Morrison to be a monster who needed killing. Did not ask for rogues to use her as a pawn in their political games. The instability you describe is not her fault. It is the fault of vampires who cannot accept that our king has chosen to exercise his right to protect whom he chooses. A third elder spoke. A woman named Isolde, whose voice sounded like wind through dead trees. We invoke ancient law, she said, and Constantine felt ice crystallize in his chest because he knew what was coming. When a protected mortal causes instability that threatens our kind, the king must choose between throne and mortal, must decide whether his personal attachments matter more than his responsibility to his people. You have until dawn, Constantine, 6 hours to make your decision. If you abdicate, the pact dissolves, and she is unprotected, but you are freed from the burden of ruling creatures who no longer trust your judgment. If you keep the throne, she must be removed, eliminated as a threat to our collective security. Constantine heard Maya's sharp intake of breath from the bedroom and felt through the bond her horror and fury, and underneath it all, a terrible resignation, like she had been waiting for this moment since the night he first marked her. I refuse both options, he said, and his voice was arctic enough to make even the ancients pause. I will not abdicate, and I will not allow harm to come to Maya Chen, which means you need to present a third option, or leave my territory before I demonstrate exactly why I have held this throne for 800 years. Irina stepped forward from her position by the wall, her scarred face thoughtful in a way that made Constantine pay attention, because she was not given to speaking in council, unless she had something worth saying. There is precedent for a third option, she said carefully. Marry the mortal under human law, make the protection a private matter rather than a political statement. Give the humans and the vampires alike a conventional explanation for why you shield her. The council can dismiss it as eccentricity rather than weakness. Rogues lose their political leverage, and she gains legal protections that exist outside our world. The council members looked at each other, and Constantine saw the calculation in their ancient eyes, saw them weighing the absurdity of a vampire king marrying a human waitress against the alternative of civil war or a weakened throne. Vampires do not marry humans, Marcus said flatly. It is beneath our dignity, reduces us to playing at mortal conventions that mean nothing to immortal beings. Constantine felt something shift in his chest as he considered Irina's suggestion, felt the rightness of it settle into his bones despite the council's scorn. Marriage would create a legal shield, a public explanation, a framework that both worlds could understand. And underneath the political calculation, he realized with startling clarity that he wanted it, wanted Maya bound to him in every way that mattered, wanted the legal and social and magical ties that would make her irrevocably his. He heard the bedroom door open and turned to see Maya standing in the doorway, wearing his white dress shirt that fell to her knees, her feet bare and her throat still bruised despite his blood, her silver-starred eyes taking in the council with the expression of someone who had already decided she was done being afraid. You would give up being king, she said quietly, addressing Constantine while the council watched with predatory attention. For me, you would walk away from 8 centuries of power and responsibility. Without hesitation, he said, and meant it absolutely, meant it in ways that terrified him, because he had never in 800 years cared about anything more than he cared about the empire he had built. But looking at her now with her defiant chin and wounded throat, he knew he would burn it all down if it meant keeping her breathing. That is insane, Maya said, and her voice was rough from being choked but steady underneath. I am nobody. I am a waitress from Seattle who makes minimum wage and lives in a studio apartment. I am not worth a kingdom. You are the first thing I have cared about in 300 years, Constantine said. And he heard the council members shift uncomfortably because this was more vulnerability than he had shown in centuries, more naked truth than a king should ever reveal. You are worth every crown I have ever worn, and every enemy I have ever made. You are worth the throne and the title and the power, all of it means nothing if you are not here to give it context. Maya was silent, and he felt through the bond her struggle to process what he was offering, felt her trying to reconcile the impossible reality of a vampire king willing to abdicate for a mortal woman. "What if I leave?" she said finally. "What if I just disappear, move to another city or another country, get far enough away that the pact dissolves and you are freed from this choice?" Constantine crossed the room in 3 strides and took her face in his hands, gentle despite the desperation clawing at his chest. "You are marked now," he said. "Every vampire in North America can see the silver in your eyes, can sense my protection on you like a beacon, and if you leave my territory, you become fair game for every rogue and rebel who wants to hurt me through you. You would be hunted, and I would not be there to stop it. Would be trapped here maintaining a throne that means nothing if you are dying somewhere beyond my reach." They stood frozen in that tableau, and Constantine felt the council watching, felt time ticking toward dawn and the impossible choice looming, felt the weight of 8 centuries pressing down on him. Then Maya took a breath, and he felt her decision form through the bond before she spoke it aloud. "What if I marry you?" she said slowly. "But I stay myself. Keep working, keep my life, keep my independence, but wear your ring and accept your protection publicly. What if we make this real in the human world while keeping the pact private in yours?" "The council will not accept half measures," Constantine said, even as hope flared in his chest. "They want absolute solutions, clear boundaries, and a marriage that leaves you autonomous will look like exactly the kind of compromise that demonstrates weakness." "Then make them accept it," Maya said, and her voice was hard enough to cut glass. "You are the king, are you not? You are the one who has held this territory for 800 years, so make them accept the compromise or admit that you serve them rather than the other way around." Constantine felt something fierce and proud unfurl in his chest as he watched her turn and walk barefoot into the living room, watched her face down 6 ancient vampires with nothing but conviction and a borrowed shirt. "I invoke right of challenge," Maya said, her voice steady as she met each council member's eyes in turn. "If any of you can give me one reason why his protection of me weakens you that is not based in cowardice or political posturing, I will leave tonight and you will never see me again. But if you cannot provide that reason, if all you have is fear of what the rogues might think or concern about what the humans might notice, then you accept the marriage as a compromise and move on with your immortal lives." The silence was absolute, and Constantine felt his heart, which had not beat in 800 years, seemed to stutter in his chest as he watched Maya stand her ground against creatures who could kill her with a thought. "You are mortal," Alara said finally, and there was something like respect in her frozen eyes. Bold, impressively so, but still mortal and still fundamentally incapable of understanding the complexities of our political structure. "And you are immortal cowards hiding behind him," Maya said, gesturing at Constantine. "You have lived for centuries, accumulated power and knowledge and resources beyond anything I can imagine, and yet you are afraid of what 3 rogue vampires might say about your king choosing to protect one human woman. You talk about stability and tradition, but what I see is fear. Fear of change, and fear of being challenged, and fear of admitting that maybe the old ways are not always the right ways." Irina laughed, a short, sharp sound that made everyone turn to look at her, because in the 300 years she had served on the council, no one had ever heard her laugh. "She has a point," Irina said, and her scarred face was almost smiling. "We are being cowards, hiding behind protocol and precedent, because we are uncomfortable with Constantine caring about something more than he cares about maintaining order. The marriage is a reasonable compromise. It provides cover for both worlds, and if we cannot accept it, then perhaps we are the ones who are weak." The council members looked at each other, and Constantine felt the political currents shifting, felt the balance of power recalculating as they weighed their options against Maya's challenge. "Very well," Marcus said finally, his ancient voice heavy with reluctance. "We accept the marriage as a compromise, A private pact made public through mortal convention, but understand that you will be under scrutiny from this moment forward. Any sign that the mortal causes further instability, any indication that your judgment is compromised, and we will revisit this decision with less mercy. Constantine felt relief and dread war in his chest, because they had won the battle, but the war was far from over, because scrutiny meant every choice would be examined, and every mistake would be used against them. He looked at Maya standing barefoot in his living room, having just faced down immortal predators with nothing but words and will, and he felt something shift permanently in his chest, some final wall crumbling to reveal the truth underneath. He was hers, completely and irrevocably, bound by more than blood or magic or political necessity, and whatever came next, they would face it together or not at all. Maya stood in front of the full-length mirror in Constantine's bedroom at 5:30 in the morning, wearing a dress that Irina had somehow procured in the 3 hours since the council had grudgingly accepted their compromise. Cream silk that fell simply to her knees without embellishment or fuss. Elegant in the way that expensive things were elegant when they didn't need to prove anything. Her feet were bare because she had refused the heels Irina offered. Had said if she was getting married at dawn to a vampire king in his penthouse, then she was doing it as herself, and that self did not include wobbling on stilettos while promising forever to an immortal being. The bruises on her throat had faded completely thanks to Constantine's blood, but the silver sparks in her eyes remained, visible even in the pre-dawn dimness, marking her as something between human and other, claimed and protected, and fundamentally changed. She heard movement in the living room and knew the judge had arrived, a discreet older man who had performed enough unusual ceremonies for enough unusual clients that he asked no questions when Constantine's people called at 4 in the morning, requesting a marriage license and his services before sunrise. Maya took a breath and walked out of the bedroom into the living room, where dawn was just beginning to break over the city, the sky turning from black to deep blue behind the tinted windows that filtered the dangerous light into something Constantine could tolerate for brief periods. He stood by the windows in a black suit with no tie, his pale hair catching the dim light, and when he saw her, his expression shifted into something Maya had no name for, something between reverence and terror, and a hunger that had nothing to do with blood. Irina stood to one side in her usual dark clothing, her scarred face impassive, but her eyes holding something that might have been approval, and the judge waited by the windows with his small book and his bureaucratic patience. The ceremony was brief and legal and entirely human, the judge reading the standard words about love and commitment, and choosing each other, and Maya felt the strangeness of it wash over her, the absolute surreality of standing in a glass tower at dawn, promising to honor and cherish a creature who had not been human for 800 years. Constantine's voice was steady when he repeated the vows, but Maya could feel through the bond his uncertainty, his fear of doing this wrong, of promising things he didn't know how to give, and she wanted to tell him that she was just as terrified, but there was no time for reassurance, because the judge was finishing his script and saying the final words. "You may kiss the bride," the judge said, and Constantine hesitated for the first time since Maya had known him, stood frozen like he had forgotten how this part worked, or was afraid of breaking her with the wrong touch. Maya felt her heart clench at his uncertainty, at this ancient, powerful being rendered motionless by the prospect of kissing his new wife, and she stepped forward and took his face in her hands, pulled him down to meet her, and kissed him. It was cold and strange and gentle, his lips like winter against hers, and he tasted like metal and snow and something darker that might have been blood, or might have been just the flavor of immortality. He made a sound low in his throat and his hands came up to frame her face, careful and reverent, and Maya felt through the bond his overwhelming relief that she had taken the choice from him, had made it easy when nothing about this was easy. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, and whispered so quietly that only she could hear, "I don't know how to love something that ends." Maya felt tears prick her eyes because she understood what he was saying, understood that loving her meant knowing he would lose her, that her mortality was a timer counting down to inevitable grief. "Then love me while I'm here," she whispered back. Love me now in this moment, and in every moment after, until there are no more moments. And then you can grieve, but at least you will have had something worth grieving for. Constantine's hands tightened fractionally on her face, and she felt through the bond his acceptance of that bargain, his willingness to take the joy, knowing the pain would follow. The judge cleared his throat and congratulated them with professional warmth, handed over the marriage certificate that made it legal in the human world, and left with an envelope of cash that ensured his discretion. Irina approached and did something shocking. She smiled, actually smiled with genuine warmth, and said to Maya, "You are braver than any warrior I have known, and I have known many across many centuries." Then she left them alone in the penthouse as dawn broke fully over Seattle, the sun rising behind the tinted glass that turned the dangerous light into something manageable. Constantine led Maya to the windows and positioned himself carefully in the shadow while she stood in the filtered sunlight, the division between them literal and symbolic all at once. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a ring, platinum band with a single black diamond that caught the dawn light and threw it back in dark fractals. "It was my mother's," he said quietly, holding it out to her. "She was mortal too, human and fragile, and she loved my father with a fierceness that terrified him because he knew eventually she would age and he would stay frozen." Maya took the ring and felt the weight of it, the history, the grief embedded in the metal. "What happened to her?" she asked, even though she suspected she knew the answer. "She got old," Constantine said, and his voice was distant like he was looking at something 800 years in the past. "She got old and sick, and my father could not bear to watch her fade, could not stand the thought of existing in a world where she no longer drew breath. So when she finally died, he walked into the sun, chose to burn, rather than continue without her." Maya slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, cold against her skin. "And you," she said, "when I'm gone, what will you do?" Constantine met her eyes, and she saw in them a resolve that was both comforting and heartbreaking. "I will keep going," he said. "I will continue ruling and protecting and existing, because you asked me to love you while you're here, which means honoring your life by not wasting my immortality on grief. I will keep going for you, because you deserve better than a lover who cannot survive your loss." Maya felt tears spill over, and she didn't try to stop them, just let them fall while Constantine watched with an expression of helpless tenderness. He pulled her into his arms and held her carefully, like she was made of glass, and she buried her face against his chest and cried for the first time in front of him. Cried for the impossible situation they had chosen, for the love that had a timer, for the fact that she had found something worth keeping just when she had learned it could not be kept forever. He stroked her hair and murmured words in a language she didn't recognize, something old and musical, and she felt through the bond his own grief mixing with hers, his acceptance that this would end, but his determination to make the journey worth the destination. When she finally pulled back and wiped her eyes, he handed her a handkerchief that was probably worth more than her monthly rent, and she laughed wetly at the absurdity of it all. "What now?" she asked. "Now we figure out how to build a life in the gaps between your world and mine." "Now you live," he said, and his voice was firm. "Exactly as you want to live. No compromises except the ones you choose to make. And I make sure you have the freedom and safety to do exactly that." Maya thought about it and made her decision. "I want to keep working," she said. "At the diner, for now, because it's mine and I earned it, and giving it up would feel like letting Derek win retroactively. I want to keep my apartment, even though it's tiny and has terrible water pressure, because it's the first place I lived alone without fear. But I'll come here on my nights off, I'll sleep in your too comfortable bed and drink your expensive coffee and learn how to exist in your world without losing myself in the process." Constantine looked pained, but he nodded because he had promised she could live as she wanted. "I hate your apartment," he said. "It has inadequate locks, and the building has no security, And every time you're there alone, I can feel through the bond my own anxiety about all the things that could go wrong. Maya smiled and took his hand. Then I guess you'll just have to trust that I can take care of myself, she said. And on the nights when I can't, I'll call you, and you can come running like you did at the warehouse, and we'll figure it out together. They stood at the window as the sun climbed higher, her hand with the ring pressed against the glass, the city waking below them in a symphony of traffic and light. His hand covered hers, cold against warm, death against life, and Maya felt the bond hum between them like a live wire, felt the connection that was part magic and part choice and part something neither of them had words for yet. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The bruises Derek left that Constantine saw, the protection that had cost them both their comfortable detachment, the violence in politics and impossible choices that had brought them here. Protection costs, she thought. It costs vulnerability and risk, and the constant awareness that caring about someone means giving them the power to destroy you. But loneliness costs too, costs years of invisible suffering and silent endurance, and the slow erosion of believing you matter. And for the first time in years, Maya was not alone, was not invisible, was not enduring in silence. She was seen and protected and chosen, and if that came with danger and complications and an expiration date, well, at least it came with connection. 1 week later, Maya was back at the diner pouring coffee during the morning rush, her hands steady and her movements automatic from years of practice, and the ring on her finger caught the fluorescent light every time she reached for a cup. The other waitresses had noticed and asked, and she had given them a simple version of the truth. That she had met someone, and it had been fast, but it had been right, and they had congratulated her with the particular warmth of people who had watched her survive Derek and were glad to see her moving forward. She was refilling coffee for table 6 when she felt the temperature drop and looked up to see a vampire standing in the doorway, young by immortal standards, maybe turned in his 20s, with nervous eyes and the particular stillness that marked his kind. He approached the counter slowly, and Maya met his eyes without flinching, without the fear she might have felt 2 weeks ago, and she saw him register the silver sparks in her gaze. "You're queen now," he said quietly, his voice awed. "In our world, by law of marriage to the king, you hold a title and power that most vampires spend centuries trying to acquire. I just wanted to see if it was true, that he actually chose a mortal, that the rumors were real." Maya set down the coffee pot and studied him. "He chose me," she said simply. "I chose him. That's all there is to it. No grand political statement or revolutionary ideology, just two people who decided they would rather face the complications together than spend another century alone." The young vampire stared at her for a long moment and then nodded slowly, something like hope flickering in his ancient eyes, and he left without ordering anything. Maya watched him go, and felt the weight of what she had become settle more fully on her shoulders. Not just Constantine's wife, but a symbol. Proof that the divide between human and vampire was not as absolute as everyone had believed. She looked out the window and saw Constantine's black car parked across the street, saw him sitting in the driver's seat, watching her with an expression she was learning to read, protective and proud and faintly amused. Irina sat in the passenger seat, and even from this distance Maya could see her say something that made Constantine's mouth quirk into what might generously be called a smile. "She'll be trouble," Irina said, her scarred face turned toward Constantine with rare approval. "She has opinions and courage and absolutely no sense of appropriate deference to authority, which means your reign is about to become significantly more interesting." "I'm counting on it," Constantine replied, and his eyes never left Maya as she moved through the diner with competent grace. "She's not my possession or my pet or some mortal toy I keep for entertainment. She's my equal in the ways that matter, in courage and will and the capacity to choose difficulty over comfort when the stakes are high enough." Maya caught his eyes through the window and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and made the silver sparks dance. And he smiled back with an expression that 800 years of detachment had not prepared him for. She held up the coffee pot in mock salute, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement. This strange ritual of connection across the divide of glass and species, and the fundamental difference between life that ended and life that continued. She was not his possession, Maya thought, as she turned back to her tables and her work and her deliberately maintained normal life. She was his partner, his choice, his vulnerability made manifest, and he was hers in return. An impossible protector who had traded certainty for connection and control for the messy, beautiful reality of caring about something that would inevitably end. The bond hummed between them even across the distance, cold and warm, death and life, impossible and real. And Maya thought that maybe that was enough. Maybe choosing each other daily in the face of everything that made it difficult was its own kind of forever. She poured coffee and took orders and lived her life exactly as she wanted. And across the street, an ancient vampire watched over her and smiled, and the cost of their protection was vulnerability. But the reward was that neither of them had to be alone anymore.